Hello, welcome back to Only One Again. My name is Bonnie, and today I'm going to be telling you a really crazy, awful true crime story. This is all about the Hart family. This story has so many different layers to it. I found it such an interesting story when I first heard of this. The Hart family, it all started with a couple, Sarah and her wife, Jennifer Hart. So both of them were from South Dakota, and they began their relationship when they were both in university together, studying to be elementary educators. Sarah was the more passive, sensitive of the two, and Jennifer was more dominant. She had a really big personality. She liked to be in control. She really liked her voice to be heard. They eventually got married, and they decided they wanted to have some children. When they were both in their 20s, in 2005, they began fostering, and they started out fostering a girl who was about 15 years old. And, at first it started off okay, even though that she was kind of a typical moody teenager, and she was sometimes, difficult, as teenagers sometimes are. The two, Jennifer and Sarah, told this girl, you're going to be in our family for at least until you turn 18 years old. It was a long-term plan on their part. However, they soon began complaining to coworkers about this girl. They complained that she would pick garbage or pick food out of the trash and things like that. Although later, this girl denies that ever happened. And then this couple started talking about wanting to adopt these 3 kids who were a sibling group. And they started talking about this idea, and they were talking about it with the 15-year-old girl, saying, we're going to be one big happy family. You're going to be the big sister. We hope you have, a good influence on the younger ones. And they were all getting really excited about these new additions to their family. However, a week before they were going to have these 3 siblings join their family, Jennifer and Sarah took the 15-year-old girl to a regularly scheduled therapy appointment, and they left her there. They had packed up all of her belongings, and without her knowing, they abandoned her at the therapist's appointment and just never returned. They never said goodbye. They never explained anything. They let the therapist tell this girl that she would be going home to a different family with a new couple. That's, to me, just such a devastating, traumatic thing to happen to an already sensitive, vulnerable girl who was already in the foster care system. To have the rug pulled out of you like that, I can't imagine. And I don't understand why they would choose to do it this way, but that's what happened. So they ended up adopting these 3 siblings. This was in September 2006. They adopted Marcus, age 7, Hannah, age 4, and Abigail, age 2, from Texas. They were living in Minnesota, but the adoption happened in Texas. And not too long later, they decided to adopt again 3 kids from a different family, 3 siblings. And in 2008, they adopted Devonte, age 5, Jeremiah, age 4, and Sierra, age 3. They officially were adopted in February of 2009, but they started living with the family in 2008, also from Texas. So now they were this big family with 6 kids. It appears that one of their favorite things to do as a family was posing for photos and videos. They loved posting these videos on social media. They loved Facebook. At the time was the big social media. Specifically, Jennifer would tell everybody on Facebook, show what a great, happy, big family they were. And weren't they great for saving all of these kids, was sort of the message. And they were really known for documenting their adventures together as a family. It was sort of a picture perfect modern day family. So Sarah worked, and Jennifer would stay home and take care of the kids. And they would often go to festivals, like these kind of new age festivals where people are doing dancing and music and yoga and things like that. And so again, they would always document this in their social media, took their kids to different activism rallies. They took them to protests like the Black Lives Matter protests. And in particular, Devonte, would wear these signs around his neck that would say free hugs. And it would be these great photo ops that they would have. And one in particular, one photo when Devontae was 12, this photo went viral. It was actually like national news or whatever because Devontae was crying in this photo. It was actually during a 2014 protest that was happening in Portland, Oregon. And Devontae had tears running down his face and he was hugging a police officer. And this photo went viral and people were calling it the hug shared around the world. And it was sort of this, symbolic photo that people really loved to share. And of course, the ladies loved the attention that it was bringing them. Unfortunately, the truth was the reality of the situation was far different from what their social media was portraying. They were not just a big, happy family. The reality was that they were abusing the children, neglecting them. They were depriving them of food. They were beating them. They were very controlling, dating all the way back to 2008 when one of the teachers observed bruises on one of the kids. So it was actually Hannah, who was 6 years old at the time. And her teacher observed that she had some prominent bruising on her arm. And when asked about it, she said that Jennifer had hit her with a belt as punishment. So police and social services were brought in. They interviewed Sarah and Jennifer, and they said they had no idea how she got the bruise. Maybe it was when she fell down the stairs. They just kind of pled ignorance. They had no idea, and the case was closed legally. Then in November 2010, another teacher discovered bruises on a different child. This time it was 6-year-old Abigail. And the teacher saw that she had bruising on her back and then a big bruise from her sternum down to her navel. So she questioned the child and she said that Jennifer had beaten her essentially as punishment because they had found a penny and they accused her of stealing. And so they gave her this harsh punishment where she punched her and then stuck her head under cold water. And then she hit her again. And then she was sent to her room with no lunch as a further punishment. The authorities were again involved and they questioned the children. And the children at that point were honest and they said that, yeah, they were often spanked and they often were deprived of food as a form of punishment. At that point, Sarah was the one who admitted to being abusive and she pled guilty to assault and was sentenced to community service. So it's interesting because Jennifer was the one who was being accused of doing this harm, but Sarah was the one who pled guilty. Also interesting is how light the punishment was. Around a year later, Hannah went to a school nurse and complained that she hadn't eaten food all day and she was really hungry. When the parents were called on that, they said, she's playing the food card again. It wasn't that big of a deal to go without food. Why is she complaining about it? Sort of a thing. And so it wasn't too long after that the children were pulled from public school and they were homeschooled after that. Another sort of trend or habit pattern that they had was that they would move homes. They would move to a new city. So they moved to Oregon. And in 2013, a family friend called Child Protective Services because they were concerned about the children. They were worried that the children were being deprived of food again. The children were physically smaller than their age. They should have been, they were looking malnourished. And of course, Jennifer and Sarah broke off all communication with that friend because they had, the friend had ratted them out. And when the kids were interviewed this time, they were clearly coached. Their parents had told them what to say and what not to say. And so it was really difficult to get the truth out from the children. They did interview other people who knew the family, and other family friends said that the children were really controlled. They were expected to raise their hand before speaking. There were times where they weren't allowed to laugh at the dinner table. They seemed to be really scared of Jennifer. When Jennifer was interviewed, her answer, it just says a lot. Her response was, any family problems that we might have is because others aren't being tolerant of 2 lesbian mothers with 6 African-American children. That's what her point of view was. Meanwhile, during all of this, the family continued to participate in different activism things and going to festivals, getting their photo taken. In 2016, they joined Bernie Sanders on stage when he was doing a presidential campaign rally. So they continued to be like on display, showing like what a big happy family they were. So modern, so diverse, and like, look how great we are, kind of a thing. And in 2017, the family moved once again. This time they moved to a more rural home in Woodland, Washington, and they had like a big 2-acre property. This allowed them to be even more isolated from outside influences and also allowed them to kind of hide the abuse even easier. Their neighbors said they were very private. In August of the same year, 2017, Hannah was 15 years old at the time, and at 1:30 in the morning, she jumped out of the second story window, and she ran over to the next door neighbor's house. She begged them. She said, please don't make me go back there. She said, they're racist and they abuse us. And she pleaded with the neighbors to help her. The neighbors, called the DeKalbs. The DeKalbs listened to her. However, Jennifer quickly came over to the home and took Hannah back. The next day, Jennifer and actually the whole 8-person family, all of them, went over to the neighbor's house, and Jennifer apologized. And she said, Hannah was lying. She made it all up for attention, and the kids occasionally act up because they are drug babies. She said, their mothers were bipolar and they've got issues, and sometimes they lie. And then she made Hannah hand over a handwritten apology note that Hannah had written saying, I'm so sorry for lying. I made it all up. Which clearly the whole thing is designed to make, it's just so awful. Knowing the truth of what happened, it's gross. And also for Hannah to have reached out in such a desperate way, and then for that to happen, it was a message to all the other kids, clearly, that there's no point in reaching out for help because the same kind of thing will happen. Months later, a relative of these neighbors called the police because it was really weighing on them that incident had happened. And so they called the police and they explained what had happened, and they said, we're really concerned for these children. And then Devontae started going over to the DeKalbs, the neighbor's house as well, this time begging for food. He would say that they're starving. He said, please don't tell my mothers about this. He even went as far as like writing out a wish list of some different food that the kids needed or wanted or whatever, and said, please put some of this food like in a box near the fence and then I can sneak it. And so the neighbors, after this had happened a few times, they were like, okay, this is crazy. So they called CPS to check in on the Hart family. And this was in March of 2018.
Ago or so, one of the children came over and started asking for food. And it went on for a period of time until we kind of determined that he was probably reaching out. And we determined that we should call the Child Protective Services, and that's what we did on Friday.
And you said you think it was Devontae who was coming to ask for food.
Oh,
it was
Devontae.
Definitely.
You guys have shown us pictures, and we've talked about that one, that it was Devontae for sure.
Well, they obviously had
Yeah.
a separate lives. Their public life was presented, and they did it to us. They portray this happy little family, and yet, the night before, their daughter's telling us, please, 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 begging us not to make her go back and that they were abusing her. It's unbelievable. What you're showing me, that they were part of that, and the pictures, it was not the family we saw next door.
Yeah.
I feel like there was nobody in their court. I feel that if there was people that knew these people, how could you miss that?
Yeah.
Because I gleaned that quickly with hardly any interface. It's not how I thought it was going to end. I thought it was going to end in a beautiful life for them. Breaks my heart.
Yeah.
So officials went to check on the family to make sure that the kids were okay. So they physically went to the home and knocked on the door, and no one answered. And they had just seen them go inside the house, so they knew that they were home, but they just weren't answering the door, so they left. The next day, the family got into their big family car. They had a GMC Yukon. It was like a big SUV for all 8 of them to fit in. And they drove south. They drove all day. They drove until they reached Fort Bragg, California. And then they stayed there for about a day. It's not really known exactly what they were doing during this time because there's not a lot of documentation on it. March the 26th, 2018 was when tragedy happened. And this is so awful. Jen took all of them in the van and drove off a cliff. She drove their vehicle over a 100-foot cliff on California's state Route 1. She accelerated. They did some testing on the car afterwards, and they could look at the car's software and see exactly what had happened. And this was a very clearly deliberate act. The software indicated that Jen had stopped the SUV at this turnaround point where there's a cliff that goes down, and then there's the water right there. And they could see that she accelerated for about 70 feet and went straight off the cliff. There was no skid marks, there were no brake marks. She accelerated off the cliff. It landed upside down. Everybody died. Nobody was wearing seatbelts. They tested Jen's blood alcohol level, and it turns out that she was well above the legal limit. Sarah was tested, and in her system was a lot of Benadryl. Jennifer and Sarah's bodies were in the car. 3 of the children's bodies were outside of the car near the vehicle. Marcus, aged 19, Abigail, aged 14, and Jeremiah, aged 14. And 3 of the bodies were nowhere to be found. The other 3 children, Hannah, age 16, Devontae, age 15, and Sierra, age 12, they were believed to have been in the vehicle, and they were considered missing. Police searched. They said they knew that there was a possibility that the water had come in. There was a lot of rain that happened in the days following. So it made it difficult to know where the bodies were. And so they searched and searched, and they were able to, on 2 weeks after the crash, they were able to find Sierra's body in the ocean. And then in 2019, they found remains of Hannah's body. Devontae's body was never found, but it is kind of agreed upon. All signs pointed that he was in the car as well. So everybody thinks that his body was just washed out to the ocean. So it seems like they gave some of the children Benadryl to make them more drowsy, I suppose, to make them more compliant, I'm guessing. People at first thought it was an accident because nobody's mind automatically goes to that this was on purpose. I mean, who would do this? But then looking further at the evidence, police realized that this was a crime. This was a deliberate murder-suicide. But people were curious to know, who else knew about the plan? Was Sarah in on it? How far in advance had they planned it? And a lot of those answers we'll never know. However, they were able to go and find evidence that Sarah had actually Googled searches for, right before the crash, about the lethality of Benadryl and the nature of death by drowning and other clues that made it seem like she knew what was going to happen. People who knew the family initially were completely shocked by what happened. I mean, it was just, they had no idea. According to the outside world, people who knew them casually, Jennifer and Sarah were regarded as caring, devoted mothers. They had dedicated their lives to these 6 adopted children and, always talking about love and acceptance. And what was actually happening in the home, it was a complete surprise to most people who thought they knew this couple.
Because there were no skid marks, there were no brake marks.
On March 26, 2018, an SUV was spotted in the Pacific Ocean, 100 feet below a cliff in Northern California. Investigators soon found the bodies of Jennifer and Sarah Hart and 3 of their adopted children, but their other 3 kids were still missing, including 15-year-old Devontae.
Every memory I have of them is just a big hug.
They seemed like the picture-perfect family, but as the investigation into their deaths unfolded, it became clear they were anything but.
They both decided that this was going to be the end.
Investigators say Jennifer and Sarah intended to kill themselves and their 6 kids. They discovered Sarah used her phone to make some disturbing searches in the days before they died, including drowning, hypothermia, and death by Benadryl. Sarah's body was found to have deadly levels of Benadryl in her system, and at least some of the children had it in their systems too.
When hearing about this story, I am always thinking, why? Why did they, obviously, why did they abuse the children? Why did they do that sort of thing? I mean, they were just awful people. However, what pushed them to that extreme response? Why would they kill all of the children if they wanted to just kill yourselves? I don't understand murder-suicide. Do the suicide part first if you're gonna, However, a lot of people are kind of guess that based on the timing of everything, they think they just didn't want to get caught. Perhaps they just feared that the abuse and the neglect of the children was going to be found out. The authorities were onto them. The authorities had been checking in on them, and they had been checking on them daily, and maybe they thought there's no way we can cover this up. It's going to be obvious that we're abusing them, and we don't want to be found out. So I don't know. None of it makes sense to normal people, because normal people don't do this kind of evil. There's also a financial aspect to this whole story that I've been reading about. When you do adopt children, depending on what state you're in, a lot of people get a decent amount of money received from the state in order to help care for the children. So these kids were all adopted from Texas. They were getting subsidies for their children, totaling almost $2,000 a month. Some reports say they were getting hundreds and hundreds of dollars per child. And that was a lot of money, considering the fact that Sarah didn't receive a lot of money for her job. Jennifer was a stay-at-home mom since, I think, 2006. And Sarah was a store manager, which is fine, but it wasn't really enough to support this huge family of, needy children. And I think they were really relying on this subsidy from the state. But once the kids reached 18 years old, that money was no longer going to be available. I've read a bunch of reports saying that they were in a lot of credit card debt. They were living way above their means. So there was probably that added pressure on them as well. My other question is, how could it have been prevented? And there are so many people who reported the abuse. There were family friends who reported it. There were neighbors who reported their concerns. Teachers, the social services came in and interviewed the kids. It seemed like there were people sort of sticking up for and trying to advocate on behalf of the children. However, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. The neighbors should have done something immediately, in my opinion. Instead of waiting so long until, so many different instances happened. The children obviously should have been taken away and not just questioned in front of the mothers. Obviously they're going to say whatever they want to hear. Not enough was done. I just don't understand if they didn't want to have these children, if they regretted it, if they got too many children too soon and then they thought, oh gosh, we're in over our heads, we can't do this. Why didn't they just do something better? I mean, there are options. It's just such an awful case, and I'm to think how scared the kids would have been at the end what a scary, awful way to go. I just think this whole story is terrible. Some people say that these two women, possibly more Jennifer than Sarah, but I'm not excusing Sarah's behavior at all either, because she didn't do anything to save these children. Some people think they had like this white savior complex because they liked the praise they got. They liked the attention that they got from having 6 Black children. You know, 2 white lesbian mothers with 6 Black children. It's going to draw a lot of attention and praise from a lot of groups. And they loved it. They loved the attention they got from their social media posts. They love looking like these saviors. And maybe that's what initially kind of kept them going, but then they were just not equipped to take care of 6 children with a lot of needs. And that's not to excuse their behavior. That's just, I'm thinking that's what started happening. And it got to the point where they just, the only way that they saw out was just to end it all for all of them, which is so evil. So that is the story of the Hart family. There is a podcast, a really great podcast called Broken Hearts, all about this. Let me know if you have heard of this case before and what your thoughts are. And when I did this talked about the story on my TikTok a year or so ago, it brought up a lot of interesting conversations from different angles. Some people who were saying about racial issues, saying that white parents shouldn't be allowed to adopt Black children. Other people who were saying it had nothing to do with race. It was, you know, anyways, it was just really interesting conversation, also to do with the whole foster system in general, how they were so quick to just let people adopt without doing enough background information or follow-up to check on the kids to make sure that they were safe after adoption happened. And, you know, it starts right from the 15-year-old girl who was abandoned by them. They shouldn't have been able to adopt after that happened. Thank you so much for joining me here on Only One again. And so if you like hearing true crime stories and other interesting things like that, I hope that you will subscribe. And if you have any ideas for other case suggestions, please let me know in the comments. And I will see you next time.